Hello, my name is Wade Sokolowski, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I want to welcome you to our online lecture series in honor of our nation's 250th birthday. Blue and Gray is excited to sponsor 30 lecture videos by Dr. Laurie Schiller, Adjunct Professor of History, retired at Northwestern University. Follow Laurie as he takes us on this incredible journey to the early period of our nation's history. In addition to Laurie's lectures, if you want to experience firsthand by visiting some of these historic sites, please check out our award-winning guide into the Revolutionary War by historian Burt Dunkerley. And of course, the centerpiece of what Blue and Gray is known for, our fabulous series of sponsored tours led by distinguished historians and battlefield experts. To learn more about the Revolutionary War and other education programs, such as our battlefield tours and Blue and Gray's initiative to expand the interpretation at many of these historic sites through the emplacement of information panels, and more importantly, how you too can become a member of Blue and Gray, please visit our website listed below the screen at the end of this video. You can find us in Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube as well. Once again, thanks for watching.
This is Lecture 12, The Nature of the Contending Forces. The third lecture of Topic 4, War in the 18th Century America. Welcome to Lecture 12, The Nature of the Contending Forces of our The American Crisis class. This is the third lecture of the fourth topic, War in 18th Century America. In the last two lectures, we examined the psychology of warfare and the key developments that changed war making in the 18th century. Okay, let's begin to take a closer look at the contending armies in America, the British, their German mercenaries, and the rebel Americans. As I said last time, we will talk about the French and the Spanish and the Native Americans at another time. Most British troops that landed on Staten Island were members of 26 regiments of the line, or marching regiments, with their distinctive names and traditions. Preceding them were battalions of grenadiers, the stormtroopers of the army. Each regiment had a company of grenadiers, but in practice, they were formed into separate battalions for active service. They were used to lead assaults on fortifications, do amphibious landings, and all this other kind of difficult, more complex work. Tall, heavy-set men were specially recruited to form these companies, and they were made to look taller and fiercer by their grenadier bearskin hats, which added a good foot to their height. The 4 battalions of grenadiers that came ashore in New York was one of the largest concentrations of these kinds of troops up to that point. A second elite unit, only recently formed as a result of the fighting conditions of the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War in Europe, was the light infantry. They came ashore with the grenadiers and were called the Light Bobs. General Thomas Gage had formed a whole regiment of them during the last war, dressed them in drab uniforms, and had them fight like skirmishers in loose order. After the war, a company was authorized for each regiment, and these men were chosen for their intelligence, athleticism, energy, and marksmanship. They were expected to fight in any terrain, move quickly, and form what we would call special forces. They wore distinctive short jackets, light equipment, and a small helmet or cap in place of the usual broad-brimmed cocked hat. Some companies added green feathers to their cap, leading to the name the Green Feathers. These special units evolved into the Green Jackets of the 19th century and the Green Berets of the 20th. They, too, were combined into special battalions, and the 4 that came into Staten Island represented the largest force of this kind in British history. Most of these men had been involved in the March to Concord and had led the assault at Bunker Hill, so they were already hardened in 1776 by heavy service in America. Accompanying the infantry was the Royal Artillery, dressed in blue uniforms, whose officers were appointed by merit and trained as cadets at the Woolwich Military Academy, where they learned the technical subject needed to be successful. Since they needed technical training, you couldn't just buy a commission in the artillery. You had to be trained correctly. 3 battalions of 72 guns landed in Staten Island, including a new generation of light and mobile field guns designed to have interchangeable parts and move rapidly to support the infantry attack on American terrain. The mobile artillery on a large scale was a shock to the Americans. The Industrial Revolution also gave the British shells, incendiaries, canister, and grape shot, illuminating rounds, and smoke shells. Then there was the cavalry. In 1757, Colonel John Burgoyne formed the 16th Light Dragoons, a new type of light horse designed to be highly mobile and heavily armed. Each trooper carried 2 pistols, a short-barreled carbine, and a long cavalry sword. Burgoyne's unit was highly successful against the Spanish, and George III created 6 regiments, which were later used in America. The last component of the British Army were the Highland regiments. They were the first of the modern British Army's successful effort to enlist their most formidable enemies into the service of the king. Most people are familiar with the Indian Gurkhas or Sikhs, but the Scots were the first of these type of units. As recently as the Battle of Culloden in 1745, the Highland clans were fighting the English, but after that, they became loyal soldiers of the Hanoverian kings. 2 of them, the 42nd Foot, later known as the Black Watch, and the 71st, or Fraser's Highlanders, came to New York. As large as British brigades, they were allowed to keep their own customs, including the kilt, and many had to learn English as they only spoke Gaelic. They ran their own schools of training, and unlike the English, their discipline centered on honor and reputation amongst kin. They also had a more direct attachment to the king per se. They swore an oath upon enlistment to be true to our sovereign Lord King George and to serve him honestly and faithfully. These were warlike people who enlisted for life and were recruited with the aid of clan elders. The record for service belonged to Private Donald MacLeod, who joined the 42nd just after it mustered as a regiment in 1740, served for 75 years, and retired to London at the age of 103. Can you imagine? We cannot forget that the American Revolution was not just a revolt against the crown, but also a civil war between Americans, some of whom, as much as 20% of the population, remained steadfastly loyal to the king. Others were non-Europeans for whom the patriot cause had little to offer, Native Americans and African American slaves in particular. However, the British overestimated the willingness of loyalist men to rally to them. Perhaps 50,000 volunteered, and while some entered the ranks of the British Army, most enlisted in provincial battalions attached to the British Army, such as Bannister Tarleton's British Legion, Butler's Rangers, mostly from New York, the King's Royal Regiment, raised in Canada, and Robert Rogers' Queen's American Rangers. As with the rebel militia, some of these units gave good service and others not. They were more prevalent in the South and formed more of the British war effort there in 1780 to 81, as we shall see. The British didn't just rely on their own and loyalist troops. They early on looked for foreign European mercenaries to hire. On August 15th, 1776, 8,000 Hessians joined the British in New York. There would be about 12,000 more German soldiers to come. The hiring of mercenaries is a very old practice. In the mid-18th century, the small states of Germany, which were loosely grouped together as part of the Holy Roman Empire, were the largest suppliers of troops in the world. The soldier trade, or Soldatenhandel, was a big business in Middle Europe where farmland was becoming exhausted and the countryside had been ravaged in the 30 Years' War, and again in the 7 Years' War recently ended. The poverty of the land created surplus population whose princes, or Landgrafs, maintained large armies which they rented out for a pretty penny when not engaged at home. It is not surprising, therefore, that the British, whose kings, after all, were German, sought to add these skilled mercenaries to supplement their own army. What is surprising is that French and German documents show that as early as the winter of 1774-75, British envoys held secret meetings with Landgraf Friedrich Wilhelm II of Hesse-Cassel to rent his army. So even before the war breaks out, the British are already looking for supplementary troops. Now, those talks failed because of the price and other terms. Now, when fighting actually began in April 1775, the British approached the Russians for 20,000 troops, trying to get cheaper terms. But the Empress Catherine declined, as did the Netherlands and Prussia. After rejecting a suggestion from Parliament to hire Moors from the Fez of Morocco, the British turned back to the Germans, primarily to Hesse-Cassel, which ultimately supplied about 60% of the German troops, resulting in American history books calling all the mercenary troops Hessians. Friedrich's model was Frederick the Great of Prussia, and although an absolute monarch, modernized his country on the Enlightenment principles of reason, order, fidelity, loyalty, discipline, and regularity. His people loved him. He also greatly expanded the army, both for security and for discipline. In proportion to the population in 1770, the Hessian army was not only the largest in Europe, but also one of the best. At the time of the Revolution, like the British, the officers and men were long-serving veterans and very professional. There were three paths to become an officer in the Hessian army. The first two led from the aristocracy or middle class, where many attended the Collegium Carolinum in Kassel and advanced on merit alone, although it never hurt to have a von in front of your name. But officers could also be promoted from the ranks. Karl Emilius Ulrich von Donop, personal adjutant to the Landgraf, was an example of the nobility who asked and was given command of the Jager Corps in America. Handsome and arrogant, self-assured, he was deferential to his superiors, but curt to his inferiors. Behind a facade of civility, he was brutal and cruel, and ordered his men on pain of punishment not to take American prisoners. He was not much loved by his men. Quite different from von Donop was middle-class-born Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl, 50 years old in 1776, and a veteran of 36 years in the army. Rahl, whose social origins reflected the majority of the Hessian officers, was the son of an officer and worked his way up from a cadet or Freikorporal in his father's regiment. His manners were rough and unpolished, and he spoke an earthy barracks room German. But he was a fighter and had been a soldier of fortune in Eastern Europe and Turkey. He was kind to his men, stood up for them, and was loved by them. He was known for his sympathy and kindness and great love for music. But he also let his sometimes less experienced superiors know what he thought of them and earned their scorn for it. Von Donop and other aristocratic officers treated him with disdain, but Jager Captain Johann Ewald commented that when it came to fighting, they were not fit to carry Rahl's sword. Rahl would be mortally wounded at the First Battle of Trenton and is viewed in American history as a tough, brutal commander, but there is much more to this complex man. Then there was Lieutenant Andreas Wiederholt, an officer who rose from the ranks and became prominent in America while serving in Kniphausen Regiment, reputed to be one of the best in the army. He enlisted as a private, rose to sergeant major, and after distinguishing himself in the 7 Years' War, was commissioned. Although only a lieutenant, he was 44 years old in 1776 with 25 years' service. He would make captain, but with his social origins, he would not go further. After the war, he became a general in the Portuguese army. Although from very different social origins, these officers all believed in hierarchy, order, and discipline, and shared a deep contempt for the rebeller, as they called the colonists. They despised American language of liberty and freedom as the cant of cowards and traitors. American textbooks have portrayed the Germans as faceless paid mercenaries, but while they hoped to make their name and fortune in the American War, they were men of courage and honor who believed in their service to their prince and lived and died by a warrior's creed. Hessian privates shared these same values. In Hesse, all male children registered for the military service at the age of 7, took examinations at 16, which the government then used to exempt some men based on their occupation and strongly encouraged the rest to enlist. The sons of poorer peasants made up the bulk of the infantry. Sons of gamekeepers and foresters tended to enter the Jager units, which were the equivalent of the British light infantry. Artillerists were the sons of industrial workers in the cities. Most recruits joined voluntarily, and their families were exempted from some taxes. But not all were volunteers. Those considered expendable people, such as the unemployed, masterless men, etc., were pressed by recruiting parties. Discipline was harsh, enforced by beatings with sticks and cudgels. Capital punishment was used more often than in the British Army, and Hessian soldiers knew their families at home would suffer for their misconduct. Relentless drill and savage discipline made even the pressmen good soldiers. They internalized the strict discipline and took pride in being part of it. As an example of how they were trained to a condition of instinctive and unquestioning obedience, at the Battle of White Plains, the Kniphausen Regiment was ordered to advance against heavy fire through a field of grass that caught fire. They put their cartridge boxes over their heads so they wouldn't explode and kept coming. Driven back with heavy losses, they came again and carried the day. But they were not driven simply by fear. They believed strongly in order and obedience and swore a personal oath to the Landgraf. Their equipment was engraved with Pro Princip et Patria, for Prince and Fatherland. One other major thing sets the Hessians apart from the British. While both sides plundered, the Hessians were encouraged to do so. Remember, the basis of their participation was a treaty that gave a huge payment to Hesse-Cassel. The officers and men felt that they should make their fortunes in America, a land far richer than the poor farms they had left. They were encouraged to get booty, and if they were able to forage on their own, the British didn't take 6 shillings a month out of their pay. This was an army of entrepreneurs looking to make a profit, which put them at odds with their British allies who didn't want to turn the loyalists into rebels by plundering them. George Washington would have loved to have had a professional army like the British or the Hessians. But that is not what he did have, nor did he have the time to create one before immediately confronting the British in Boston in 1775. By December 1776, he also had begun to understand that he could never have an army of order and discipline, for, as he wrote in a letter, a people unused to restraint must be led, they will not be drove. To impose the heavy floggings and capital punishments that were routine in a European army would have destroyed his army. His men would not have stood for that abuse. But it took him time to understand this. As a slave owner, perhaps, he also had problems translating the idea. As we shall see, the two armies of order and discipline won the battles of the summer and fall of 1776, but an army of free men won the winter campaign that followed. They did so not by imitating a European army of order, but by developing the strengths of an open system in a more disciplined way. That Washington was able to understand this and use it makes him look even larger in the history of the founding of our nation. If there is a painting that sums up the nature of the soldiers and the struggle that they were engaged in, it is the iconic Washington Crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Lütze, a German immigrant who began the work to encourage liberal revolutionaries in his homeland in 1848 and finished it in 1850 after the revolution failed. The original was displayed in the Bremen Art Museum and was actually destroyed in a British air raid on September 5th, 1942. Some have jokingly called it the final British retribution for the American Revolution. Of course, the one we know now in the Met was a second copy he painted in 1851 and was sent to America. If you look closely at the details, you will see that Washington's small boat was crowded with 13 men. Their dress tells us they come from many parts of America. One man wears the short tarpaulin jacket of a New England seaman, and upon closer examination, you will see that he is black. Opposite him is a recent Scottish immigrant still wearing his Balmoral bonnet. A third is an androgynous figure in a loose red shirt, maybe a woman in a man's clothing, pulling an oar. At the bow and stern are hard-faced Western riflemen in hunting shirts and deerskin leggings. Huddled between the thwarts are farmers from Pennsylvania and New Jersey in blanket coats and broad-brimmed hats. One carries a countryman's double-barreled shotgun. The other looks very ill, and his head is swathed in a bandage. The soldier beside them is unusual in that he has a full uniform. The blue coat and the red facings mark him as a member of Hazlitt's Delaware Regiment. Another figure wears a boat cloak and an oiled hat a prosperous Baltimore merchant might have used on a West Indian voyage. His sleeve reveals the facings of Smallwood's Silk Stocking Maryland Regiment. Behind them is the weapon of a 13th man on scene. Dominating the center are two gentlemen of Virginia, Washington and Lieutenant James Monroe, holding a flag against the storm. Washington holds a brass telescope and wears a heavy saber, symbolic of a statesman's vision and soldier's strength. Lütze painted these men as distinct individuals, but they are all in the same boat with a common mission, working desperately against current and wind. While many have debunked the details, such as the time of day and the wrong flag, Lutz's point was to create an atmosphere of high drama and desperation around the event. This was the low point of the revolution, when failure literally meant the end of the cause. We see them in their diversity and their stubborn autonomy as they lived the rights they were defending. So Washington commanded what has been called an Army of Liberty. The dilemma that he felt so keenly was how to lead an amateur army that came from different parts of America and, while they were joined in a common cause, thought and understood it in very different ways. How, in fact, to lead men when they thought and acted differently from one another and from their commander-in-chief. Washington represented one strand of this knot. He had been raised in a hierarchical society, a great landowner whose Enlightenment philosophy was one of moral striving through virtuous action and right conduct, by powerful men who believed that their duty was to lead others in a changing world. They believed in combining power with responsibility and liberty with discipline. A code of honor was central to this conduct, and an idea of courage was a major part of the code. Washington thought of liberty as a condition of autonomy from external domination, but in the sense that only a gentleman of independent means could be truly free. This notion he shared with the gentry of Virginia. The world was an unequal place, and he accepted the inequities of society. This included a hierarchy of race as well. Against this were people he had a great deal of difficulty relating to, yet formed 75% of his people of his army around Boston, New Englanders. To them, democracy was a leveler. Society was more fluid. They didn't like his hierarchical attitude, and he found them undisciplined and disorderly. Most of these New Englanders were literate and came from yeoman families with land and property. These men were raised to a unique idea of liberty as independence, freedom as the right of belonging to a community, and rights as entailing a sense of mutual obligation. Washington had trouble with one regiment, the 14th Massachusetts Continentals in particular. Colonel John Glover's regiment was recruited from the fishing towns around Marblehead, and his seamen and fishermen reflected the ethnic composition of these maritime towns, which included both Native Americans and free African Americans. Washington was not happy about this, given his attitude towards slavery, but the 14th was perhaps the best in the Army, saved it several times in New York, and manned the boats across the Delaware. He learned to compromise, and the Continental Army, beginning with that regiment, became the first integrated national institution in the United States. Then there were the frontier regiments of riflemen, so deadly with their American-made rifles that British and German officers cut off their rank insignia to disguise themselves. Usually wearing hunting shirts, they were known for their ferocity and indiscipline. They were difficult men to lead, and Washington found that trying British-style discipline on them produced near mutiny. One of their flags was a coiled rattlesnake with "Don't tread on me" as the motto, an individualistic definition of liberty at odds with the collective consciousness of New England towns, liberty as hierarchy amongst the Virginia gentry, and the literal liberty for blacks in the Marblehead Regiment. There were also regiments of silk stocking gentlemen from the mid-Atlantic states, who were comprised of wealthy young men who came together to form a voluntary association. They treated their enlistment as a contract and felt they could resign at any time if not treated correctly and with the proper social deference. Here was another idea of liberty as a voluntary agreement. Another group were the Philadelphia Associators, who were originally Benjamin Franklin's idea of a voluntary militia, and were composed of all classes of Philadelphians and Pennsylvanians who had come together to defend Philadelphia during the French and Indian War. The group was revived in 1775, as since Quaker Pennsylvania had no militia, Quakers being pacifists. A cross-section of the city's diverse population, officers were elected by secret ballot, and dress was to be egalitarian. A hallmark of these regiments was direct democracy, and each had an elected committee of privates. In these units, although the powerful wealthy were generally chosen as its leaders, liberty was thought as something that belonged neither to the rich nor the poor, but to all together, an idea fundamental to the founding principles of Pennsylvania itself. Rights for all was very radical in George Washington's mind. In keeping with the British Army, which Washington well knew, there were also units of light cavalry, dragoons, and artillery. Added to this diverse group of regiments of Continentals Washington also had to deal with militia, which came and went as it pleased, and partisans, over which he had very little control. So the American forces were a far cry from the armies of order and discipline, to say the least. In the next topic, we will begin to see how these armies interacted with each other as war came to the American colonies.